Okay, so the first reading we're going to go through is the Liker reading, which is the NSK case study. So we're looking at recontextualization and factory-to-factory knowledge transfer. So the key question that we're looking at is, how does culture affect globalization and technology transfer? And the problem that we've seen is that uncertainty concerning whether a firm's products, processes, resources, and capabilities will continue to be aligned in new cultural environments. So there's a lot of history in this case study, which gives you some background on how NSK came to absorb the facility in Ann Arbor. It used to be a Hoover facility, and they started as a joint venture and then eventually bought it out. And their expectation was eventually they would, revamp the plant to be equal to at least the capability of the Japanese plants. But they could see already that there were some issues associated with that move. There's a lot of writing about how disappointed the Japanese were with the kind of the attitude of the workers. They certainly didn't have the same cultural environment that they did in Japan. And they were concerned about, how this would work. And they began by asking the Americans to come forward with their suggestions, which they did, and they were very surprised that the Japanese, proposal was considerably more expensive and more elaborate than the American one. But they were excited about it. But obviously there were still going to be some issues going forward, and that's really what we highlight in the case study. So the intended scope of the transfer eventually, when they decided, yes, this is what we're going to do, it was an automotive, they were an automotive supplier, and so they wanted to be close to the automotive market at the time. They were looking to transfer over product development processes, so things like milestones, deliverables, and reporting, the product development workplace organization, how they did things, design specifications, and teamwork processes. So lessons learned, problem solving, and decision making. What they found, though, was that there were certain technology characteristics like system embeddedness, which is the degree to which technology and processes rely on other organizational systems. Autonomous system embedded, so meaning that it's not just a standalone process or system. It is taking input from somewhere else and producing output for some other area. And so that middle section is the embedded nature of the system. And then also the knowledge base, so the know-how associated with implementing and operating technology. There was tacit knowledge, which was subjective, taken for granted, socialized knowledge, and explicit, objective, codified, and rational. So these were the different types of technology characteristics that they were looking at, and we'll go through what they ran into in a couple of slides. But there were different aspects of it. It wasn't straightforward. We just don't march in and put something down and expect it to work. We have to understand that this different culture is going to accept some of these things differently than maybe our own culture. So there was a schematic, and this is a eventual build out of the schematic that gives you an idea of the scope at which different areas need recontextualization. So on the physical equipment side, you've got a sort of piece of equipment. Very low recontextualization, right? So we get what this is all about. We understand what it is. There's explicit knowledge here. This is a wrench. This is a press of some sort. It was understood, these pieces of equipment. They were easy to understand and to incorporate into the new plant. On the other side, social processes required high recontextualization. They had tacit knowledge, which was stuff that the Japanese just took for granted, right? It's just part of their culture. Everybody cleans up in their area. They don't have a maintenance group. Everybody just picks up around their space, and they feel it's very important to keep things neat and clean. That wasn't the same with the Americans. And as a matter of fact, there was an issue that was highlighted in the case study where the union workers, because each different work product was unionized, and because a different person did it, they actually felt bad doing the work, right? I'm taking work away from another one of my, union buddies, which, obviously was difficult for the Japanese because they don't have that situation in Japan. And everybody just takes responsibility for, what is around them, and they want things to look nice. So this was an area where they had, some issues. And obviously skill sets and standard operating procedures, again, different quadrants required different levels of contextualization. Production tools, lower contextualization, standard operating procedures, higher contextualization. So anyway, that kind of gives you the layout of where things in the case study fell as to how quickly people were able to bring them into the American facility. And then we overlay some more detail, and this is more of the graph that's in the book, where you can see there are things like labor relations that we talked about. This is a social process. This takes high recontextualization. So it is something that's very specific to this plant, to the United States unions, and it was difficult for the Japanese to understand that. The way that they made decisions, another thing that had to be, reworked. Rewards and recognition, all these things, these social processes required a lot of high recontextualization. On the other hand, you've got machining and automated material handling that was easy for them to figure out. And then things that had explicit knowledge and system embeddedness were, engineering expertise, design specifications, quality procedures, things like that. The standard operating procedures and skill sets. So this kind of just gives you an idea where we're relating technology characteristics to recontextualization. So much of what makes an organization system work is situated in tacit knowledge. It's just things that people take for granted. The way that we implement things is based on our culture, and we do it comfortably, and people understand it because they're part of the culture. The more explicit the knowledge base, the easier to decontextualize, the more control of recontextualization. So the more explicit the knowledge, the more it's just, understood that you push the button or you turn the handle, where it's right there and it's easy to understand. It's easy to recontextualize it. Global managers need to consider the tacit and embedded nature of work processes and anticipate how they can be favorably recontextualized in another cultural setting. So it's difficult to do this, right? You don't just assume that the new area, the new company is going to just accept everything, especially if you're coming from another culture altogether. One thing, even in America, obviously we have kind of different cultural things in the South versus the North, the East versus the West. But at the same time, it's easier to understand. We all speak English. We're all Americans, so it's an easier transfer. When you're going from a culture like Japan, where the culture in and of itself is very different from ours, there are a lot of things that are just implied that people understand that managers must take into consideration in order to be successful moving innovations from one region to another. And that's it for this section.